Before we begin this incredible story, please subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you never miss our emotional stories that touch the heart. The morning sun cast long shadows across the men. Military training yard as dozens of young recruits stood in perfect formation. Their boots were polished to a mere shine, their uniforms crisp and neat. Among them stood Mark Thompson, a 22-year-old soldier who had joined the Army 6 months ago with dreams of serving his country. He was average in height, with brown hair cut military, short and eyes that always seemed to be analyzing everything around him. Mark was not the strongest recruit in his unit. He was not the fastest runner. His shooting scores were decent but not exceptional. What Mark had was something different, something that most people could not see on the surface. He had a mind that worked like a chess player, always thinking 3 moves ahead. He studied tactics in his free time while others played cards. He observed patterns where others saw chaos, but none of that mattered to his fellow recruits. To them, Mark was just another face in the crowd, someone who blended into the background. They laughed and joked during breaks, formed their tight groups, and rarely included him. Mark did not mind much. He was there to learn, to become better, to prove something to himself. The training yard was buzzing with nervous energy that particular morning. Word had spread through the barracks like wildfire the night before. Colonel Davidson, a legend in the military, was coming to observe their training. The colonel was a man whose reputation preceded him wherever he went. He had served in multiple combat zones, earned medals that most soldiers only dreamed of, and was known for his sharp eye for talent. He could spot potential in a recruit the way a jeweler spots a diamond in rough stone. Sergeant Hayes stood at the front of the formation, his weathered face stern as always. He had been training recruits for 15 years and had seen thousands of young men and women pass through these yards. Some became excellent soldiers. Many were just adequate. A few washed out completely. He barked orders, and the recruits snapped to attention. The exercises began with basic drills. Running, push-ups, obstacle courses. The recruits pushed themselves harder than usual, knowing that the colonel's eyes would be on them. Sweat poured down faces. Muscles burned. But everyone kept going, driven by the desire to impress. Mark moved through the exercises with steady determination. He was not the first to finish any drill, but he was never last either. He kept a consistent pace, never giving up, always focused. His face showed concentration, not strain. While others gasped and struggled, Mark seemed to be in his own world, processing everything, learning from each movement. During a brief water break, some of the other recruits started whispering and laughing. Mark overheard snippets of their conversation. They were making fun of him, calling him unremarkable, saying he would probably end up behind a desk somewhere pushing papers. One recruit named Danny, who considered himself the best in the unit, smirked and said loud enough for Mark to hear that some people were just not cut out for real military work. Mark said nothing. He simply took a drink of water, wiped his mouth, and prepared for the next drill. He had learned long ago that words meant nothing. Actions were everything. His father had taught him that before he passed away 3 years ago. His father had been a quiet man, a factory worker who never boasted but always delivered on his promises. Mark carried that lesson in his heart. The sun climbed higher in the sky. The training continued, and somewhere in the distance, a black military vehicle was approaching the base, carrying Colonel Davidson to witness what would become a moment that Mark Thompson would never forget. The afternoon heat was becoming unbearable as the recruits finished their 5th drill of the day. Shirts were drenched with sweat and faces were red from exertion. Sergeant Hayes ordered them to form up again in the center of the training yard. As they scrambled into position, a black vehicle rolled through the main gate of the base. Everyone straightened up immediately. The vehicle came to a stop near the edge of the training yard, and out stepped Colonel Davidson. He was a tall man in his early 50s, with silver hair cut military style and a presence that commanded respect without him having to say a single word. His uniform was decorated with ribbons and medals that told the story of a lifetime of service. His eyes were sharp and penetrating, the kind of eyes that seemed to see through pretense and straight into a person's character. Sergeant Hayes saluted crisply, and the colonel returned the gesture. They spoke briefly, too quietly for the recruits to hear. Then the colonel nodded and began walking along the line of recruits. His boots clicked against the pavement with each measured step. He stopped occasionally to look at a recruit, sometimes asking a question, sometimes just observing. His face gave away nothing about what he was thinking. Mark stood at attention in the middle of the formation, his eyes fixed straight ahead as military protocol demanded. His heart was beating faster than normal, but his breathing remained steady. He could feel the colonel's presence moving down the line, getting closer. Around him, he could sense other recruits tensing up, trying their hardest to look impressive. Danny, the recruit who had mocked Mark earlier, stood a few positions down. He puffed out his chest slightly, clearly hoping to catch the colonel's attention. Danny had the best physical scores in the unit, and everyone knew it. He was strong, fast, and confident. His father was a military officer too, and Danny had grown up hearing stories of glory and combat. He believed his destiny was to follow in those footsteps. The colonel passed by several recruits without much reaction. Then he stopped in front of Danny. There was a moment of silence as he looked him up and down. Danny's face remained serious, but Mark could see the hint of pride in his eyes. The colonel asked Danny a question about his training. Danny answered with textbook precision, his voice strong and clear. The colonel nodded once, then moved on. A collective breath seemed to release from the formation. The colonel continued down the line, his expression unchanged. He was almost at Mark's position now. Mark kept his eyes forward, his posture perfect, his mind calm. He was not trying to impress anyone. He was simply being himself, a soldier, doing his duty. Then the colonel stopped. He was standing directly in front of Mark now. Mark could feel those sharp eyes studying him, taking in every detail. The moment stretched out, feeling much longer than it actually was. The entire training yard seemed to go quiet. Even the wind seemed to pause. The colonel tilted his head slightly, still looking at Mark. Then he did something unexpected. He stepped back and asked Mark to step forward from the formation. Sergeant Hayes looked surprised, but said nothing. Mark moved forward smoothly, stopping at the correct distance from the colonel and saluting properly. The colonel studied Mark for another long moment. Then he asked a question, not about physical training or weapons. He asked Mark what he thought was the most important quality in a soldier. It was a test, Mark realized. Not of strength or speed, but of thinking and character. Mark did not rush to answer. He took a moment to consider the question seriously, the way he considered everything. Then he spoke in a clear, calm voice. He said that the most important quality was adaptability. The ability to think clearly under pressure, to adjust to changing situations, to learn from mistakes and keep moving forward. Physical strength and skills were important, Mark said, but the mind was what made a soldier truly effective. The training yard remained silent. Some recruits exchanged glances, confused about why the colonel had singled out Mark of all people. Danny's face showed a mixture of confusion and irritation. Sergeant Hayes watched carefully, his experienced eyes beginning to see something he had not noticed before. The colonel's stern face did not change, but something flickered in his eyes. He nodded slowly, then asked Mark another question. This one was more complex, a tactical scenario that required quick thinking. Mark answered again, laying out a strategy that showed he had been paying attention to everything he had learned. His response was not flashy, but it was smart and practical. For the first time that day, the colonel smiled. It was a small smile, barely visible, but it was there. Colonel Davidson turned to Sergeant Hayes and spoke in a voice loud enough for all the recruits to hear. He said that in his 30 years of military service, he had learned to recognize certain qualities in soldiers. Physical prowess was important, he said, but wars were not won by muscles alone. They were won by minds that could strategize, adapt, and lead when circumstances became chaotic. The recruits listened in absolute silence. This was not the kind of speech they had expected. They had thought the colonel would praise the strongest or the fastest among them. Instead, he was talking about thinking and leadership. Some of the recruits began to shift uncomfortably. Realizing that they might have been focusing on the wrong things, the colonel continued speaking. He said that every generation of soldiers faced new challenges that required new approaches. The modern battlefield was complex and unpredictable. Technology changed rapidly. Enemies adapted their tactics constantly. What the military needed most were soldiers who could think critically, who could see patterns others missed, who could remain calm when everything around them was falling apart. As the colonel spoke, his eyes kept returning to Mark. It was becoming clear to everyone watching that Mark had somehow impressed this legendary officer in a way that none of them had expected. The confusion on their faces was evident. Mark was not the star of their unit. He was not the one they talked about in the barracks. He was just Mark, the quiet guy who kept to himself and never caused any trouble. Danny stood in formation. His jaw clenched tight. He could not understand what was happening. He had worked harder than anyone in the unit. His scores were the highest. His physical abilities were unmatched. Yet the colonel had barely acknowledged him and was now focusing all his attention on Mark Thompson, the most unremarkable recruit in the entire unit. It did not make sense to Danny. It felt wrong. The colonel then asked Mark to demonstrate something for the group. He gave him a complex tactical problem involving a small unit trapped behind enemy lines with limited resources and no communication with command. Mark was told to explain how he would handle the situation. This was not something they had trained for specifically. It required creativity, strategic thinking, and the ability to work with incomplete information. Mark stood there for a moment, his mind working through the scenario. The other recruits watched, some expecting him to fail, others genuinely curious about what he would say. Sergeant Hayes crossed his arms. His experienced eye now fully focused on this recruit he had perhaps overlooked. Mark began to speak. His voice was steady and confident, not arrogant, but assured. He laid out his analysis of the situation, identifying the key problems and the resources available. Then he explained his strategy step by step. It was not a reckless plan full of heroic action. It was thoughtful and practical. He talked about using terrain to their advantage, about timing movements to minimize risk, about keeping the unit together and maintaining morale under pressure. He even mentioned contingency plans if things went wrong. As Mark spoke, the colonel nodded several times. When Mark finished, there was a brief silence. Then the colonel turned to Sergeant Hayes and said something that made the sergeant's eyes widen slightly. He said that Mark's analysis was exactly the kind of thinking taught in advanced tactical courses for officers. It's not basic training for recruits. The weight of those words settled over the training yard. The other recruits began to see Mark differently now. This person they had dismissed as average had just demonstrated abilities that impressed a colonel with 3 decades of experience. Some felt respect beginning to form. Others, like Danny, felt resentment growing. The colonel then did something even more surprising. He asked Mark about his background, about why he had joined the military. Mark explained honestly. He said his father had taught him the value of service, of doing something bigger than yourself. He talked about wanting to make a difference, not for glory or recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. His words were simple but sincere. Colonel Davidson listened carefully to every word. When Mark finished, the colonel was quiet for a moment, seeming to weigh something in his mind. Then he looked at Sergeant Hayes again and said they needed to talk after the training session ended. The sergeant nodded, understanding that something significant was happening here. The colonel told Mark to return to formation, and the training continued. But everything had changed now. The atmosphere in the yard was different. The recruits moved through their remaining drills with less confidence than before. They had witnessed something that challenged everything they thought they knew about what made a good soldier. Their assumptions had been shaken. Mark returned to his position in the formation, his face showing no emotion. He did not feel proud or superior. He simply felt like he had answered questions honestly. But around him, he could sense the shift in how others were looking at him. Some glances held newfound respect. Others held jealousy or confusion. Danny's eyes burned with barely contained anger whenever they fell on Mark. The training session finally ended as the sun began to lower in the sky. Sergeant Hayes dismissed the recruits, and they began to disperse toward the barracks. The colonel and the sergeant walked toward the administrative building, deep in conversation. Mark gathered his gear and started heading back with the others, his mind already thinking about the evening routines ahead. That night in the barracks, the atmosphere was tense. Usually there was joking and conversation, but tonight many recruits were quiet, lost in their own thoughts. Danny sat on his bunk, his face dark with frustration. A few of his close friends gathered around him, and Mark could hear them talking in low voices. They were complaining about what had happened, saying it did not make sense. That physical ability should matter more than answering theoretical questions. Mark lay on his own bunk, reading a book about military history. He tried to ignore the hostile energy coming from Danny's corner of the barracks. He had not asked for the colonel's attention. He had not tried to make anyone look bad. He had simply been himself. But he knew that did not matter to people like Danny. Some people measured their worth by comparing themselves to others, and they could not stand when someone unexpected rose above them. The next morning, something interesting happened. Sergeant Hayes called Mark to his office before the regular training began. Mark entered and saluted properly. The sergeant told him to stand at ease, then looked at him with an expression that was hard to read. After a long moment, Sergeant Hayes spoke. He said that Colonel Davidson had been very impressed with Mark's performance. The colonel had made a recommendation, something that rarely happened with recruits this early in their training. Mark listened carefully, not allowing himself to react until he heard everything. Sergeant Hayes explained that there was a special program in the military for soldiers who showed exceptional strategic thinking and leadership potential. It was an elite training track that prepared soldiers for special operations and command positions. The program was extremely selective and demanding. Most recruits were not even told it existed. But Colonel Davidson had recommended that Mark be considered for evaluation. The weight of these words settled on Mark's shoulders. This was an opportunity he had never imagined. Special operations, elite training. It was the kind of path that could define an entire military career. But Sergeant Hayes was not finished. He leaned forward and said that acceptance was not guaranteed. Mark would have to go through intensive evaluation. More importantly, the sergeant said, if Mark accepted this path, his life would become much harder. The training was brutal. The expectations were crushing. Many candidates washed out. Was Mark prepared for that? Mark did not hesitate. He said yes. He was prepared. He had not joined the military looking for an easy path. He had joined to be the best soldier he could be, to serve with excellence. If this opportunity could help him do that, then he wanted to try, regardless of how difficult it became. Sergeant Hayes studied Mark's face for a long moment, then nodded. He said he would forward the recommendation to the appropriate command. Mark was dismissed. As Mark left the office, his mind was racing. He kept his expression neutral as he walked back toward the barracks, but inside, emotions swirled. Excitement, nervousness, determination. This changed everything. He thought about his father, wished he could tell him about this moment. His father would have been proud, Mark knew that. But he also would have reminded Mark to stay humble, to work hard, to never let success go to his head. When Mark entered the barracks, Danny was there with several other recruits. They stopped talking when they saw him. Danny's face was cold as stone. He walked up to Mark and stood close, trying to intimidate him with his larger physical presence. Danny said that everyone was talking about what happened yesterday. He said that some people got lucky sometimes, impressed officers with smooth words, but that real soldiers were proven in action. It's not conversation. Mark looked at Danny calmly. He did not step back or show fear. He simply said that he respected Danny's abilities and had never claimed to be better than anyone. He was just doing his best, the same as everyone else. His words were respectful but firm. He was not going to be pushed around or made to feel ashamed for impressing the colonel. Danny's face reddened with anger. He wanted Mark to back down, to show weakness, to give him an excuse to escalate the confrontation. But Mark just stood there, calm and composed, his eyes meeting Danny's without fear or aggression. After a tense moment, Danny turned away with a curse, pushing past Mark roughly. His friends followed him out of the barracks, leaving an uncomfortable silence behind. Over the next 2 weeks, Mark's life became increasingly difficult. Danny and his group made sure of that. They went out of their way to make Mark's training harder. During team exercises, they would not pass him equipment when he needed it. During group runs, they would jostle him or try to trip him. In the mess hall, they spread rumors about him, saying he was the colonel's pet, that he had somehow cheated or manipulated his way into favor. Mark endured it all without complaint. He did not report Danny to Sergeant Hayes. He did not retaliate or argue. He simply kept his head down and continued working. Every morning, he woke up before everyone else and ran extra miles. Every evening, he stayed late on the training range, practicing his shooting until his arms ached. He studied tactics and strategy late into the night when others were sleeping. He was preparing himself for the evaluation that was coming. Other recruits watched this unfold with mixed feelings. Some admired Mark's resilience and began to respect him more. They started to see that he was not trying to show anyone up. He was just genuinely dedicated to becoming a better soldier. A few of these recruits began to treat him with more friendliness, sitting with him at meals or partnering with him during drills. But many others sided with Danny, either out of loyalty or fear. The barracks became divided. Then came the day of the evaluation. Mark was called to report to a different part of the base, an area where regular recruits rarely went. He put on his cleanest uniform, made sure everything was perfect, and walked across the base with his heart pounding. He knew this was his chance. Everything he had worked for, everything his father had taught him about perseverance and character. It all came down to what happened next. The evaluation took place in a secure building. Mark was greeted by a team of 3 officers he had never seen before. They were all experienced special operations personnel, and their faces showed the hardness that came from years of difficult missions. They did not smile or try to make Mark feel comfortable. They simply directed him to begin. The evaluation lasted for 6 hours. It was the most intense experience of Mark's life. They tested his physical endurance with exercises that pushed him to his absolute limit. They gave him impossible tactical scenarios and demanded solutions under time pressure. They put him in simulated stress situations where he had to make split-second decisions with incomplete information. They questioned him relentlessly, trying to break his composure. Looking for any sign of weakness or dishonesty, Mark gave everything he had. When his body screamed for rest, he pushed harder. When his mind felt overwhelmed, he forced himself to think clearly. When they tried to rattle him with aggressive questioning, he stayed calm and answered honestly. He made mistakes. He knew that. No one could be perfect under this kind of pressure. But he never quit. He never made excuses. He faced every challenge head-on with determination and integrity. When it was finally over, the officers dismissed him without giving any indication of how he had performed. Their faces remained neutral, unreadable. Mark saluted, thanked them for the opportunity, and left the building. His uniform was soaked with sweat. His muscles trembled with exhaustion, but he felt a strange sense of peace. He had given his absolute best. Whatever happened now was out of his control. Mark returned to his barracks late that evening. Most of the recruits were already asleep. He showered, changed into clean clothes, and collapsed onto his bunk. Sleep came quickly, deep and dreamless. The next morning, he woke up and went through his normal routine, trying not to think about the evaluation results. He knew it might be days or even weeks before he heard anything. But fate had other plans. During the morning formation, Sergeant Hayes appeared with an unusual expression on his face. He called Mark forward in front of the entire unit. Mark's heart began to race. This was it. Whatever decision had been made, he was about to learn it in front of everyone. Danny and his friends watched with barely concealed hope that Mark had failed. Sergeant Hayes looked at Mark for a long moment. Then he said something that made Mark's breath catch in his throat. The evaluation team had submitted their report. Mark had not just passed. He had achieved one of the highest scores they had seen in years. His performance had been exceptional in every category. Mark Thompson was officially accepted into the Special Operations Training Program. A stunned silence fell over the formation. No one moved. No one spoke. The words seemed impossible to many of the recruits standing there. Mark Thompson, the quiet recruit who had been dismissed as unremarkable just weeks ago, had achieved something that most soldiers never even got the chance to attempt. He was going to Special Operations Training. Mark himself could barely process what he was hearing. He maintained his military bearing, standing at attention, but inside his emotions were overwhelming. Pride, gratitude, disbelief, all mixing together. He thought of his father again, and this time tears threatened to form in his eyes. He blinked them back, refusing to break his composure in front of everyone. Sergeant Hayes continued speaking. He explained that Mark would be transferring to a different facility in 1 week to begin his new training. Until then, he would continue with regular duties. The sergeant's voice carried a note of respect now that had not been there before. He told Mark that he had proven something important. It's not just about his abilities, but about the value of dedication and quiet strength. Then he dismissed Mark back to the formation. As Mark returned to his position, he could feel every eye on him. The reactions varied wildly. Some recruits looked at him with genuine admiration and respect. They understood what an incredible achievement this was. A few even smiled at him, silently communicating their congratulations. But others, particularly Danny and his group, looked furious. Their faces were dark with resentment and jealousy. The training day continued, but everything felt different. Mark moved through the drills in a kind of daze, still trying to fully accept his new reality. His life was about to change in ways he could barely imagine. Special operations training was legendary for its difficulty. He would be pushed to limits he had never experienced. He would train with the best soldiers in the military. He would learn skills that most people never even knew existed. That evening, as Mark was packing some of his personal items in the barracks, several recruits approached him. These were some of the ones who had started to respect him over the past weeks. They congratulated him sincerely and said they had learned something important from watching him. They had realized that being a good soldier was about more than just physical strength. It was about character, intelligence, and perseverance. Mark thanked them humbly, saying he had just tried to do his best every day. But not everyone was happy. Danny appeared in the doorway of the barracks, his face twisted with anger. He started to say something hostile, but one of the other recruits stepped between them. This recruit, a guy named Peters, who had been neutral before, told Danny to let it go. He said that Mark had earned this opportunity fairly, and there was no point in being bitter about it. Danny glared at him, then at Mark, but finally turned and left without another word. The week passed quickly. Mark continued his training, said goodbye to the few friends he had made, and prepared mentally for what was coming. On his last day at the base, Colonel Davidson made another unexpected appearance. He asked to speak with Mark privately. They walked to a quiet area near the training yard where this whole journey had begun. The colonel told Mark that he had seen something special in him from the very first moment. It was not anything obvious or flashy. It was a quality that could not be taught, a combination of intelligence, composure, and inner strength. The colonel said that special operations soldiers needed these qualities even more than they needed physical prowess. He told Mark that the training ahead would be brutally hard, that there would be moments when Mark questioned whether he could continue. But the colonel believed Mark had what it took to succeed. Then the colonel said something that Mark would carry with him for the rest of his career. He said that in the special operations community, soldiers earned cal signs, special names that reflected their abilities or personalities. These names were badges of honor, earned through proven performance in the field. The colonel said that Mark reminded him of a particular type of warrior, one who was quiet and often underestimated but deadly effective when it mattered most. He said that if Mark succeeded in his training and proved himself in the field, he would earn a cal sign, and the colonel predicted what that cal sign might be. Black Viper. The name sent a shiver down Mark's spine. Vipers were snakes that waited patiently, struck with precision, and were far more dangerous than they appeared. It was a perfect metaphor for the kind of soldier Mark was becoming. Quiet, strategic, underestimated by enemies, until it was too late. Mark thanked the colonel for his belief and support, promising that he would not let him down. The next morning, Mark boarded a transport vehicle that would take him to his new assignment. As the vehicle pulled away from the base, he looked back one last time at the training yard, where everything had changed. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, about his father's lessons, about the challenges he had overcome, and about the incredible opportunity ahead, Mark Thompson was no longer just another recruit. He was a soldier with a purpose, with a path, with a future that held limitless possibility. The laughter that had once echoed in the training yard when others mocked him seemed like a distant memory now. What mattered was that Colonel Davidson had spoken one name that day, and that name had changed everything. Black Viper Mark was just beginning his true journey, and the world had no idea what was coming.